officially 4:31 Iowa time, so we'll get things kicked off here. I'm sure people will trickle in a little bit as well throughout the presentation. First off, I just want to thank everyone for joining us today. We're really excited for our first EdTech Talk of 2022. We have a really amazing group of EdTech thought leaders joining us from across the country as we discuss the future of powering portable learner records. I also want to give a shout out to RID Labs for partnering with us on this event. I'm Liz Hubing, and I'm representing the Iowa EdTech Collaborative. The purpose of the Iowa EdTech Collaborative is to cultivate a vibrant EdTech ecosystem that supports the launch and growth of companies working to transform the way people learn and enhance economic development. The Iowa EdTech Collaborative is building on Iowa's unrivaled record in education to grow a human-centered learning ecosystem that nurtures innovative EdTech companies, connects the brightest minds in education, technology, and entrepreneurship, and guides the future of learning. Without further ado, I'd love to introduce our panel moderator, Martin Borda. Martin is a pioneer in educational technology, leading innovations in computer-based testing, e-learning, and adaptive learning since 2000. Martin is now Chief Measurement and Learning Officer at RID Labs, an AI and education company. He has been the Chief Executive Officer of ACT from 2015 to 2020. ACT, which is headquartered in Iowa City, Iowa, is a global leader in college and career readiness assessment and enrollment services. And under Martin's transformational leadership, has taken the lead in technologies for personalized learning, learning analytics, and dynamic learning content. Take it away, Martin.
Thank you, Liz, and welcome everyone to this session. I'm really looking forward to it. As an introduction, I'd like to say that, in our lifelong learning journey, we're going through several major transitions, from elementary school to middle school, to high school, to post-secondary education, to a job, to the next job, etc. Those transitions are far from smooth. When my 12-year-old recently moved from Mann Elementary School to Southeast Junior High here in Iowa City, an impressive inch-thick pile of paper silently moved from one school building to the other. Well, any doctor I go to here in the area can pull up my same standardized medical file. In education, we still move paper records around and treat each next phase of learning as if we're starting all over. Not exactly the way to enable portable skills. But this is about to change, thanks to standardized comprehensive learner records. A learner or employee record follows an individual from one stage of learning, transitioning into the next stage, allowing students to share their evidence of learning, their unique talents, abilities, interests, and backgrounds. The question is what to do after consistently collecting all that learner data and evidence in a single record. A learner record can be provided to post-secondary education institutions or to employers. It can be secured and exchanged on the blockchain. A learner record can facilitate lifelong learning and portable skills. And of course, it can be powered by AI, profiling a learner with multimodal data analysis, creating a holistic 360 degrees view of that person. Now, hosted by the Iowa EdTech Collaborative and RID Labs, we're now introducing a panel of national experts for an EdTech talk on how portable student records are set to transform learners, education, and job opportunities around the world. Let me introduce the panel to you, and then I'll let them introduce a bit further to themselves. First, there's Alex Kaplan, partner and global leader, digital credentials at IBM. We have Donna Kidwell, Chief Information Security and Digital Trust Officer at Arizona State University. There is Sharon Liu, Executive in Residence at JFF Labs, and Sanjay Ratnavali, President at Oasis Network Inc. and publisher Interpret Ed News. And I have an introductory question so that they can tell a bit more about themselves. The question is, please tell me how your work relates to the trend of keeping standardized learner and education records. And I'd like to start with, with Donna. Donna, please.
Sure. So ASU's ecosystem is pretty big. We've got 136,000 students, very vibrant online presence, So at any given point in time, there are, tens of thousands of students that are just associated through ASU Online with their relationships with Uber or Starbucks. Yesterday, there's kind of big news in the Wall Street Journal around our 100 million learner initiative. So we don't tend to think small. And we're trying to really understand, what does that mean? Like, what does personalized learning mean when you're talking about scale? That initiative from Thunderbird is going to be translated into a number of different languages. That's a pedagogy that's attempting to really provide something that makes sense for meeting learners where they are. When you think about these kinds of things, like their records, the demonstration of their work, our ability to, as an institution, verify this incredible experience in the context of how they want to tell their own stories and chart their own paths and journeys. Our ability to have interoperable, genuine, well thought out records that also then have a distributed nature and take advantage of the kinds of things that technology affords us. I think of that as the bread and butter to our being able to actually serve the promise of the educational experiences that come out of ASU.
Okay, thank you, Donna.
Mm-hmm.
We go to Sharon. Can you tell me about your work and how that relates to the topic?
It's great to be here. My name is Sharon Liu, and I work at a not-for-profit organization called JFF, or Jobs for the Future. It's a national organization that focuses on transforming the American workforce and education systems. And we envision towards what we envision as a future where everyone can achieve economic advancement. And one of the things that we've been thinking about a lot recently is the way that existing HR practices actually exclude a lot of people. I think many of you saw the missing persons report, or thinking about a lot of individuals who, for whatever reason, are not able to participate in the workforce system as it is designed today. So a lot of the activities and policies that we're recommending now think a lot about skills-based practices. Ways to think about what a person can do, what their achievements are, and allow those to be what gives them access to the future. So we've been thinking and investing a lot in digital credential wallets that are open and interoperable, and thinking about the ways that the data within those wallets can represent achievements that individuals not only earn through formal institutions like ASU and a number of other colleges that maybe exist, I don't know, Donna, but also informally. I think a lot of people are learning online these days. I think especially the last couple of years, the ways that people have learned have changed. And I think we should change how we record what people know and how we can verify the truth of those. So we've been thinking about how to encourage that shift on the supply side of skills and credentials, but also thinking about how can employers change their practices so that they can use these verifiable achievements to fill their workforce needs, and how can that actually provide opportunities for individuals. So I'm really excited to be here.
Yeah, thank you, Sharon. Great to have you. Then next we'll hear from Sanjay. So how does your work relate to the topic we're discussing today?
Thanks, Martin, and it's a pleasure to be on here with all of you guys. So I run a network of about 600 independent schools across the nation. It's a tiny portion of the 100 million that Donna represents, probably less than 100th of that. But they do happen to be a very influential bunch because they take up a lot of college placement, these independent schools. And our work is really focused on helping them change, particularly to help them change towards more student-centered pedagogies, competency-based, cross-curricular, project-based, social-emotional-based, and other types of pedagogies. And in that context, clearly the data that comes out of those pedagogies is very different to that pile of stuff that your 11-year-old Martin is talking about. And in fact, that pile of paper is an indication of how little education has really changed in the last 50 years. So I've been involved with Martin and with Donna on the IMS board, IMS Global being the leader in interoperable standards, particularly in relation to the Comprehensive Learner Record and its kind of partner, the CASE Network, Competencies in Academic Standards Exchange, and its leadership in open badges through its digital credential platforms. And so we've been trying to get our schools to understand where this is going potentially, so that more student autonomy can be injected into the system. And when that student autonomy ultimately translates into output that is documented, it can give them a power that is very powerful and really doesn't exist today.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay. And then Alex Kaplan, so how is your work related to the topic we're discussing today?
There's a couple different ways that my work at IBM relates to this. One is IBM as an employer, and the other is around the technical infrastructure required to create and support learning and employment records. As an employer, IBM has a long history in terms of skills-based hiring. We were one of the first employers to recognize the need to transition to a skills-first hiring strategy, as well as the importance of digital credentials in order for us to understand the kind of skills that our employees had and make sure that they were prepared for the future. So over the course of the last 4 years, while we've had our digital credentials program in place, we've issued over 3 million credentials to our employee population, and we're very actively engaged in terms of helping them understand the kind of skills that they need to be successful today, and equally important, the kind of skills they're going to need to be successful tomorrow. So I'm very actively engaged in those kind of conversations inside of our company. In addition, I lead the work that we're doing around the creation of infrastructure necessary to support what my esteemed colleagues have been talking about. And this is a pretty complicated area. So Sanjay, both Sanjay and Sharon raised the issue around standards and interoperability. But at the end of the day, what we have to do is we have to write software code, and we have to provide easy to use, simple offerings that allow for learning and employment records to be usable by individuals and by employers and academic institutions. And my team in IBM focuses on all the complex technology that underlies that: blockchain, digital identity, self-sovereignty, artificial intelligence. I mean, these are the tools that are going to allow us to bring it to scale. And one final piece, I'm very actively involved in IBM's work around creating a more diverse and inclusive workforce, both domestically and globally, and looking at new and different ways that we handle talent recruitment and talent management to bring that about.
Okay, thanks, Alex. So the next question, and let's start with Sharon in answering, is what changes in the market and in society are drivers for the development of comprehensive learner records? So what's the rationale behind it?
I think Alex briefly touched on it. I feel like there are a lot of factors, and we'll talk both supply and demand side. I think when I say demand side, I mean like if all of the institutions and learning and training providers in the world started issuing digital portable credentials, what would that change? And what we hope is that changes the ways that individuals can, like learners and workers can access opportunities. But right now, it's, to Alex's point, very difficult to do that. It's difficult for large companies like IBM, but also 60% of new job creation is with small businesses. And a lot of times, the small businesses don't have very large applicant tracking systems and do things a little bit more manually or by word of mouth. So I think one of the key questions that we have to ask ourselves is, as we are moving forward, developing the system where skills and individual credentials and records are used by individuals to access opportunity, what is the end of that? Like, how do the employers think about the practices that they have to implement for recruiting talent? The systems that they use, perhaps it's not their own applicant tracking system, perhaps it's an Indeed or some kind of talent, application intermediary. And how can we do that together? So both change the technology stack as well as change the policy approach at the same time. Now, this is very hard, and I think that all of the components need to work at the same time for this to happen. So I think a big challenge for us is to think about the different ways that a lot of these different organizations can collaborate on making that happen. And I think when people start to see, like individuals, like actual human beings that have these records, start to see that there is a purpose in collecting bunches of these digital credentials and that they can actually access opportunity with them, then we will start to see the momentum build in the marketplace.
Okay, thank you. Who else would want to answer this question about the changes in the market and society?
Well, I'd like to jump in for a couple of minutes on this
Okay,
and just to build
sure.
on what Sharon was saying. So, this is a process that's well underway. So I think one important sort of takeaway is that this isn't a theoretical conversation anymore. Over the last few years, there's been a lot of groundbreaking work done by everybody on this phone and many, many others, but we're already doing this. And so there's a genuine shift underway on the employer side, as well as on the academic side, to quickly transform ourselves and transfer to digital credentials. The things that are really driving this, I think, are one, the important shift towards a skills-based economy and the need for all the participants in the ecosystem to understand definitively the skills that people have and for those skills to be verifiable so that they can be used for consequential decision making. Secondly, the pandemic has really accelerated this discussion. And so as we have shifted towards a whole digital world, one, people have gotten comfortable with using digital-based credentials on their devices, and two, our abilities to do this at scale and efficiently are dependent upon a transition to digital. So it's there's a technology driver going on here, but also a fundamental shift in the economy that's driving this.
No, thank you for that. That's very clear. Anyone else?
Yeah, I'd
Don,
like to jump in for a couple
yeah.
minutes to
Sure.
Martin. I definitely want to reiterate what Alex and Sue said. But I think the one thing that in K-12 in particular could be a driver, because really there hasn't been much impact in my view, is equity. And however you define equity, because there's a real problem with the use of technology as an access tool in terms of just using technology to transfer data, because it depends on where it gets transferred to. So with portable records and in K-12 and its feeder into college, the problem is that the records could be received by the registrar, or it could be received by the admissions officers. Now, for the most part, the admissions officers are the ones who have the least amount of time and they need better screening tools, but they don't get to actually use those transcripts very much in screening for the bigger, larger life skills that may not be presenting the student in the way that really underneath gets to the potential of the student given their opportunities or lack of opportunities. So I think from a market perspective, the fact that equity has risen to such a high level right now could be where the admissions officers get more interested in this rather than the registrars. And at that point, we've got a movement from technology as a kind of access or a transfer mechanism to something which is much, much more meaningful.
Yeah, thank you.
Can I build upon that just briefly?
Sure.
And Sharon, I kind of want to pull on the thread of Indeed, because I think that's a really interesting, like over the weekend, if you watched any of the painful wildcard playoff games, painful for anybody who has family in Dallas and Phoenix, Indeed had these great ads of this young woman who's kind of going through this experience where Indeed is like, hey, do you also have this skill? Hey, do you want to do this interview? Okay, that's like this tremendous amount of digital trust, right, that she's got. And then Indeed's ability to see that and augment what information she's given them. I think that's fascinating. What's even more fascinating to me is that it's worth spending ad space on, that the iPhone 13 or the Pixel 6 advertised heavily over the whole of the fall, that they were safer, that you were going to get better camera angles for people of color. Like, it is now a persistent part of marketing strategies that privacy, safety, equity, inclusion are important, which means that our learners should very rightfully have a very different set of expectations about how we're going to be good stewards of that, how we actually treat their data when we take their data, and we think about that in the context of GDPR and emergent areas of privacy. Like, we need the standards to support us towards this reality. And if I think about the market trends, those advertisements are going to push expectations much faster than my registrar or my admission officers and Workday and PeopleSoft and any of the systems that we use
Right.
are ready for.
Right.
Okay, yeah. Thanks. And that leads us to another, but even more important question. So once you collect the data and evidence in a comprehensive learner record, so what can you actually do with it? So what's the ultimate goal of such a record? Just collecting it is one thing, but what's next? Sanjay, can you start answering
Yeah,
this?
I mean, I suppose I'm just continuing in my previous point that, once you've collected the data, and the data has to start its journey from a K-12 perspective at a student information system within a school, and then either be asserted or transferred to a wallet or a comprehensive learner record, and then transferred forward. So that transfer mechanism is making something more efficient. And to be honest, I'm not so interested in that. I'm more interested in how it becomes more valuable to the learner. And so, I think just in terms of other comparative situations like credit scores and financial transactions that have also had wallets, digital wallets and stuff like that, there have been certain things that have managed to make the market more efficient. One of those things is removing identity, right? If you're able to be anonymous and be able to eliminate the potential for bias with the actual stuff that you are submitting, that becomes a big driver. The same is true if you're able to be secure about your privacy. And so if there's a level playing field. So, I mean, I think those are the important pieces, at least from my perspective.
Okay, who else?
Can I just say something? I think, Sanjay, you made a really interesting point earlier when you said collected by who. And I feel like that's actually the most important part of this question is who is collecting this data, because then it gets to Donna's point about with what are they doing with this data? Because what's interesting is Indeed has this information about you, and when they make a recommendation, you're like, oh, that's very smart. Like, how did it know? Like when my Garmin recommends a workout, I'm like, oh, how did it know that I should do this other workout next? How does the system know that I should have this other skill? And it's because they have all of this data that they just collect about me. And I think that there's one really important point here, which is that individuals should know more about their data. Like, there is a data literacy element that I think is very important. These huge companies like Instagram and Meta, they use this data for marketing purposes. Your data is worth so much money, but people don't realize it. And the choice to be analyzed in this way should actually be made by the individual. So when I submit my resume on Indeed, I feel like one of the things that should happen is, and I'm not picking on Indeed, gosh, that's, it's all of these companies where I give my information. It should be like, hey, you're submitting this resume because you want to apply for this job, but we're going to look at the information on your resume and we will analyze it. Would you mind if we analyzed it and provided you recommendations? Because my Garmin is my fitness watch, and it does that. It asks me, can I analyze your information and give you recommendations? And I click yes. So that's why it's recommending that I run for 40 minutes tomorrow. But I think that that's something really important, because the way that I would answer your question is actually the person that should be collecting this data, these records, is the learner themselves, because they are the common denominator across the K-12 systems, the post-secondary workforce, and all of these other employment opportunities. And they know because they participate in every single one of these learning activities. So if they could steward their data, the data on their accomplishments themselves, hold it in one place, then they could decide how they would like this data to be used, either by applications that make skills recommendations or job recommendations, by employers as they make employment decisions. But I feel like that's, I wonder how everyone else feels about that, but that's actually a little bit.
Can I just add something to what Sharon just said? Yeah, I think, and particularly the fact that once the self-sovereign learner collects a piece of data and puts it together with another piece of data of their own, they've just created more data with something that generates a picture of themselves. So when that data is being consumed, if if the user has the ability to create that data and present a picture, that's a very, very valuable tool. And it shouldn't be corrupted by someone else who's saying, actually, I'm looking at this particular job profile and seeing that there's, you know, just a job here for 2 months and another job for 6 years, and therefore it looks like X, Y, and Z, right? I mean, I think that whole context needs to be featured in this analysis.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Actually,
Anyone
we
else?
get to,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
we get to think of that over time, right? And I think, Alex, as you think some of the threads and what you were suggesting and how IBM's thinking about this, you've got longitudinal relationships if you're a company like IBM or a university. We've got these, they're not just moments in time.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to be in relationship one way or another because you're an alum, and frankly, because you were an alum because you worked at IBM for 7 years and then had another adventure and came back. So I think part of the real question to ponder and Sharon to kind of talk about, like, who owns that and what does that look like, is your story is going to change over time. So you need, as a person, you need the ability to kind of bring to the forth the story and the narrative and the arc that may not really be obvious when you look at, you know, what ends up being a 7-page PDF resume. That doesn't necessarily tell the story that, you know, the things that I'm working on now have these roots in a project that I did 7 years ago. And that's where I was introduced to this set of concepts and how the stories kind of unfolded. So that we're talking about a whole different way of people being able to express how their contribution will work and then verify that that expression was actually true the whole through.
Yeah, and you know, and we think about it as a cradle to career continuum. And so this goes back, I think, you know, to what everybody's saying here. The individual needs to own that. This is their life. And so as they move through these different stages of their life, they need to have control over that data, the ability to decide who sees it and what they do with it, and then also have all that come back to them to control it. The thing for us all to keep in mind is this is happening, and it's really a question of how we want it to happen, but it's already happening. And if you look at all of the providers of technology across the talent space and the academic space and K-12, they're all in the process of collecting very large amounts of data and figuring out how to monetize that data to create value-added services. So, but I think we have a moment now, you know, to make some decisions about how we would like to see this happen. So that because by default, what's going to happen is, you know, that this data will be monetized just like all other pieces of data are monetized in our ecosystem today.
Okay, yeah, thanks. And Alex, now I have you. Can you give me a hint on, and you mentioned this earlier, you know, how IBM can use artificial intelligence on these learner records? So how would you utilize that? And is there a way, for instance, to kind of profiling the individual learner in some way or another? Can you answer that for me?
Yeah, I mean, you know, the application of artificial intelligence here is to look for patterns that we wouldn't normally see.
Mm-hmm.
And if you think about most of the work today about helping people with career pathways or figuring out how to matriculate through a course of learning or even a textbook, it's really a Venn diagram. And the power of artificial intelligence is to allow an individual to navigate their way through completing a course or a degree or to look for a job without having to follow any prescribed approach. So that's a very powerful shift in the paradigm, which would allow you as a learner to craft a course of study that may look very odd, but really aligns directly with you. So very strong, a lot of power there in terms of our ability to personalize education at a very granular level to each individual. In the talent marketplace, you know, one of the big questions is how do you know if people are going to be successful in their jobs? And resumes are a very, very poor representation of people. And it allows us to break that paradigm as well by being able to look at what kind of skills make people successful in what kind of jobs, and then to flip that around with that kind of understanding and to help people understand what kind of jobs they could be successful in. One of the things that came out of the pandemic, and is still certainly important today, is the disruption in employment. And so people had to very quickly decide, well, okay, well, I mean, I I worked in the restaurant industry. Those jobs are gone. I worked at a hotel. Well, where can I go find work? And, there was a lot of very successful movement, but it's very complicated. And artificial intelligence can really help people provide a very much more robust view of these kinds of challenges.
Okay.
The other thing, Alex, as you're talking, the other thing artificial intelligence can do is relieve any one of us of having to have all the responsibility for all of it, because we can't. So I think if we look at the challenges of a common taxonomy for skills, that's going to look very different as you go from sector to sector. Even within sectors, you've got try to do that for public health, where there are 5 different domains that are everything from dealing with interventions inside a community all the way to somebody studying OSHA, like really complex. And so I think one of the things that artificial intelligence kind of unlocks is that we can each bring the set of things that we know and that we're custodians of and that we're stewards of and that we offer, do that in a way that is well-formed, well-typed, applies to a certain set of rules, and then let that intelligence coming from machine learning kind of help us to make those connections and make those dots. And frankly, we're going to see things that we couldn't even think about seeing, because we're each coming with a very specific frame of how we understand our data, what regulatory environments we live in, all that kind of stuff, like completely creates the lens. I both love and have a little bit of thoughtful caution about the opportunities that AI provide to have us really think differently.
I think it also provides the opportunity to realize the value of the journey, because there's going to be a lot more focus on how much education is really costing. And therefore, I think AI can help people to build their journey and make sure that their dollars, really achieve what they're meant to be accomplishing. And I think that goes, right the way through master's programs and doctoral programs and everything.
Yeah.
I will say something, and I'm not trying to be a wet blanket. Sorry, Martin, but I feel like AI, though, is a little bit of how we are in the situation that we are in today. So the entire of the missing workers paper focused, if you read a lot of it, on the ways that the algorithm screened out people, right? So it looked for certain characteristics that it seemed like in policy would make you an unfit candidate for a position. So I think there was a question in the chat about the equity concerns. This is the equity concern. So it would screen you out if you did not have a college degree, if you had a gap in employment. And especially over the last few years, a lot of the gaps are because of caregivers who need to stay home, or military transitions, or a lot of these situations that the data sees, and it does exactly what the programmer tells it to see, but then it eliminates whole classes of individuals from the marketplace who actually need the opportunities the most. So I would also, as a word of caution, say AI is really important, but 2 things. Number 1, we should be transparent about the algorithms that are used. And number 2, we should actually ask people for permission to impose our AI on their data. So in the same way that, I got a fancy purse for my birthday, the manufacturer of the purse does not get to see what I put in it. Once they sell the purse to me, it's mine, and I put my stuff in it, and no one else gets to see the contents of my purse or my wallet without my permission. And so, anytime we use a system to analyze data, I feel like it's really important for us to say to the person who the data is about, do we have your permission to use this data? We intend to help you find opportunities. Yes or no, something like that.
Yeah, Sharon, but what's also happening is that the AI is able to look at the opportunities much more broadly now than they used to be able to in the kind of sequence that was nicely packaged for most people. So particularly with things like dual enrollment opportunities for disadvantaged communities, I mean, dual enrollment has kind of exploded. I see things like AI providing many better, different pathways to be able to navigate those, options for themselves.
I'm not anti-AI. I'm sorry. I just wanted to throw in a couple of notes of caution before we got really excited about it.
I agree with what you're saying, but those gaps sometimes have been a function of very tight sequences, right? And now with everything breaking down, I think the AI is able to push you from one gap into a much better sequence in a sense.
Yeah, great points. And I'd like to go into how we can use blockchain in securely storing and exchanging learner data and learner records. And also, I'd like to add a question that came from the audience, Joe Simons, who said, well, is there a way for students or parents to earn money on the blockchain with their digital wallets? Who would like to start answering?
Well, I'm probably the resident expert on blockchain. So I will start out by saying blockchain is a piece of technology and it's a piece of software. It's not really interesting in and of itself any more than any other piece of software. It has particular attributes which are good for this kind of situation, and there's really three of them. So one is the ability to anchor things in trust, so that you know that what somebody claims they have is in fact what they have. So if you're going to make an admissions decision based upon information provided by a student, they actually really have that degree. And I might add that research tells us that about 30% of the information provided is fraudulent, or I'll be kind, aspirational. So that's one really great attribute. A second one is it allows us to really enforce digital self-sovereignty. So all the issues around control that we're talking about are really important. And an individual can work autonomously and control their data and make decisions about whom they share that data with, how much of it they share it with, and how they can be connected. So that's a really important component of digital self-sovereignty. And then a third capability is it creates a place to store credentials that nobody owns, right? So one of the impediments to this work is nobody wants to see another great big master database built. We're talking about how this data is harvested. So it's a way to share information between parties without having anybody have control of it, and have all of those transactions to be transparent and visible. So it just offers some distinct technical capabilities that support the mission that we're all talking about.
It's also pretty expensive and will generate a very large electricity bill for those students, and maybe also a very large carbon footprint.
Well, but keep in mind, we're not talking about, we're talking about data exchange here, not mining for Bitcoin. So, the energy requirements aren't really there.
I think that's what he was saying in the question.
I see. Okay.
Well, and let's, I think it's the promise of technology that becomes the enticing and inviting thing to then inject some enthusiasm to be able to have us kind of think and motivate some parts of our organizations that might not otherwise even think that this was possible. So but revealing that promise, like actually proving it out and understanding what the affordance is, I think is, that's the challenge that we're all facing right now. And I want to be really thoughtful. I try to talk about trust technologies and to not conflate the capabilities of a distributed database with the ability to have crypto certainty around verification, with the ability to have self-sovereign identity and the power of an identity that can then be related to other digital identities, because I've already got my digital wallets. I just don't think of them as I would for learner credentials. So in my mind, we're seeing a maturation of this set of digital trust technologies, starting to then, whether it's artists figuring out NFTs or crypto new domain spaces you can get, like we're getting enough maturity that the value proposition and what job we need each piece to do is starting to be more clear. And that's going to help us to then make sure that we don't create something that is so expensive that only the right people with the right environments can use it, or that only the right institutions can participate in standing up a node so that they can be part of this distributed ownership. We've really got to have practical pilots that help us break into all of that stuff.
One pilot that I put into the chat that I think is really interesting is actually that came out of a challenge that UNICEF put out to address health education about COVID-19 in Africa. And there's an organization called YOMA, Y-O-M-A, that actually built a system around that is based on a digital credential with credentials anchored on a blockchain. And essentially it's a platform that uses verifiable credentials to help youth in Africa build up a digital CV and tools. And what it'll do is it works with local employers to match them with the skills that like students learn through these little learning activities. And obviously using AI to match with the pathways. But what it does that's also really interesting is a lot of the jobs and opportunities are local community-based activities. And as like youth use the app to learn things and complete tasks, they actually get the skills, but also get a little bit of a digital token that they can exchange for real life things like credits for connectivity or, you know, airtime or actually like school supplies and things like that. So this is an example of how something like a very real community problem that is in the education and workforce space was able to be solved using the affordances of the blockchain technology and the tokenization of the learning experience. I'm not saying, this is probably hard to sort of generalize and scale in the US, but it is that blockchain is just a piece of technology. But when you're very creative, I think, and I think this group that's on the phone, the EdTech Collaborative, is trying to do that, to think about how the tech affordances of new technology can do this. I feel like you can come up with some pretty interesting solutions.
Okay, next question is, so what should be the role of open standards when it comes to learner records?
Let's kind of play with the token ideas that Sharon just laid out.
Yeah.
You could have an experience as I don't know, we'll call it a student, but it really could be anybody that came through, designed in partnership with IBM and ASU, and ASU is giving you some credit towards a degree, while at the same time, that's a recognized experience that Alex and a team of subject matter experts who really do care about meaningful work experiences and want to reflect that. We can separately, if we've got the right kinds of interoperable open standards, be able to do our own verifications, like use the rule sets that exist inside of Alex's systems, which are different rule sets that exist inside of mine. And I no longer have to go to a registrar and say, please change the transcript, because I want to be able to reflect this cool thing that I did in partnership with an industry partner. It allows us to each have responsibility for the data that we're responsible for, and to treat that data and all the kinds of flows and with all the kinds of, well, Sharon's threatened me before with FERPA jail, so that could happen again. Like, it lets us do that if we've got those standards. And if we agree that whether it's the CLR or CASE or open badges or W3C verified credentials, like, we lean into these, actively participate in those working groups, and then actively adopt them so that we actually really can realize that, you know, another promise that the technology is making.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, if you think about the internet today, nobody could care less about how, you know, my server connects to their server. And, you know, I know we've talked a little bit about blockchain here. I would just suggest that, well, we know we'll have succeeded in this when we stop talking about blockchain and the users have absolutely no idea how this works. You know, this needs to be magic for them. And in order for that magic to happen, it's all about standards.
Related to that, could anyone or any organization play the role of being an independent lead in storing and exchange learner data? So some efforts have been going on in the past. Could someone have take the authority to be sort of a national or international data warehouse, you know, or clearinghouse of some kind? Who would like to answer that?
Well, I'll weigh in. Maybe others will as well. I think that question really has a lot to do with the political and regulatory context of the environment. You know, the American system approaches it a different way than the European community does. I think that, you know, relative to the United States, it's really got to be a distributed framework. I don't, because if there's going to be any kind of aggregation like you're talking about, it's going to come out of private sector. And I think that all of us have the perspective that we would rather have a distributed system than a one system. However, in other political and social contexts, it's completely appropriate. So this is really a policy issue. It's not a technology issue, and there are pros and cons to both.
We're already seeing some really great kind of luminary work in the North Texas region, the DCC Credential Consortium. There's lots of, I think, really interesting efforts from which we hope to learn and figure out what this needs to look like. And at ASU, we call ours the Trusted Learner Network. And a foundational premise is that to make this magic happen, you've got to meaningfully apply this technology to solve challenges that you see as an institution or that you know your learners have. That means that by the nature of doing it, you're going to solve a local problem. ASU is going to solve a problem because I've got challenges of scale, which is very different from a private four-year institution that has 7,000 students where I've got, 7,000 in one set of courses. So we're going to solve different problems, and that's great. Standards will help us to ensure that all of that problem solving then comes up to some kind of unified whole. So I kind of think that the answer to your question, Martin, is yes, that should happen in lots of different ways. And then we should be learning as fast as we possibly can, figuring out how to have conversations with policymakers, whether that's institutional policymakers or policymakers that are helping us at various regulatory levels, so that we can react to what we learn. Hopefully that we get lots of great participants in efforts just like what you're describing. And none of us expect that we have to be able to solve the whole enchilada, because we're each working to contribute in the places where we can.
Then what I can do is take a few of the questions out of the, by the way, very active chat. Thank you for all your contributions. This is one that came from John Corrigan. How will or could Web3 play a role in education, workforce skills, learner records in the future for individuals, for institutions, especially if people are creating virtual profiles of themselves intentionally or unintentionally?
Well, I don't know enough about Web 3.0, but the metaverse and all the things that I've read about it would lead me to conclude that a lot of this stuff is already going on in the pre-metaverse, right? In terms of gaming and tokens and all that kind of stuff. So I would think it's very, very likely to have a massive impact, because the metaverse, I suppose, will move with learning. I mean, I think learning is going to be a very big part of it if it ever gets off the ground. So I can see this being huge.
Well, and I think, one of the fundamental challenges with the internet today, and this applies to everything, is trust anchors, which is why there's a big focus at this point. And, we're evolving. So as we evolve, these issues we've talked about relative to digital self-sovereignty and trust really become critical. So I think it's important. I think that part of what's driving the evolution to Web 3.0 are the kind of conversations we're having today, because we all see this coming and we want to make sure that the internet has the technical capability to execute against what we're saying. And this is true across probably every kind of conversation in every industry at this point.
Yeah.
The nice thing about something like Web3 is that it gives us a way to even talk about the problem. It gives us a framing to then be able to say, well, what do you think about this and how does that impact it? Or I don't know, as a CISO, I start thinking, when Microsoft decides to acquire something like Activision, what does that mean for my own learners who are very participatory in environments like Twitch or Discord? And ultimately, I need to do some sense making in my Active Directory, which Microsoft has all sorts of ideas around how that might also play into sovereignty. Like, we get these really interesting efforts. Web3 helps us actually have some frame to take what's otherwise kind of a crazy conversation and normalize it a little bit so that we can make some meaning out of what we're seeing happen around us. My dogs want to say hi.
I think that your dogs are just contributing to the conversation, Donna, and I'm going to channel my universal dog translator and say, I think what also they want to add is that, you know, it gives us an opportunity and platform to talk about it. But I think that part of the question, if I read it correctly, was about workforce skills. And I think in the same way that the technology right now creates a gap between different types of individuals, there is also a big gap that the Web3 evolution can create. Because I think it's like, not just right now we have the broadband and device access problem causing like scores and homework to be different. That's one thing, but what if it was like, not only that a person didn't have access to a device to do their homework, and it wasn't a laptop, but it was an Oculus to, you know, participate in the virtual, you know, metaverse. That's even a bigger gap, but also like the idea of like how to even access it and what are the skills. Not only do you need to access the metaverse, but also to participate in it. This is a tremendous opportunity for us, actually, right? As we start thinking about what does STEM education look like in the future, these are actual skills that you can give to people right now, so that they can be active participants.
Mhm.
I'm going to maybe touch a little bit on David Cumberbatch's Q&A question.
Yeah, sure.
Our ability to do that is how we're going to actually see some real impact for equity concerns. And some of that is like being able to give credit where credit is due, but where our traditional mechanisms of offering credit don't necessarily serve those individuals. So we get a really different way of thinking about how to acknowledge and to really celebrate somebody's great work without expecting that they went through, you know, processes that have been in place for decades and decades. And we already know that those processes don't serve everyone that we want to serve. This lets us kind of crack that open. And so to really think about these equity concerns, I think that becomes, you know, a product design question when you're trying to figure out what to do with this, or a project design question when you're actually trying to figure out how the pilots really play out. But what a great opportunity.
Yeah, and by the way, yeah, David's question was, is AI a magic bullet, or is it there good and bad AI? Anyone else like to comment on that?
Well, you know, no technology is a magic bullet. It's the application of the technology that's the magic bullet, and that's up to human beings to decide.
Mm-hmm.
And no technology is good or bad. It's what you do with it. So I think we need to be aware when we look at any particular technology where its strengths and weaknesses are. And when you come to artificial intelligence, you know, we all have deep concern around embedded bias in artificial intelligence and it making mistakes. And because AI depends upon data sets that it's historically consuming. And, you know, there's a tremendous amount of work being done to really address that. So I think it's incumbent on all of us who work actively in this field to keep that at the forefront of our minds. And to help people, understand the challenges and the benefits of it. But again, there are no magic bullets here.
And you know, Red Labs was one of the initiators of the EdSafe AI Alliance, which now has, you know, dozens of members supporting the safe and ethical use of AI for education. And I think that's a good initiative. Let me get to a final question. This is more about your future vision. So suppose we could look 10 years ahead and look at the situation about, you know, how we would deal with portable skills and learner data, learner records. How do you think the situation will look like in 10 years? What would be the new normal? So this would be the final question for everyone. We only have, I think, 5 minutes left. So, Sharon, what's your future vision?
Oh no, I can't decide ever how to answer this question, because either I say something about our spaceship cars or I'm really pessimistic. So I'll start with the pessimistic and then I'll transition to the spaceship cars. So I think that if you look at how our society changes, actually 10 years is not that long. And one of the things that I think in my pessimistic days is that actually not much will be different. There will still be huge socioeconomic racial divides in this country, and opportunity will still be accessed inequitably. And I think that's a problem that we deal with now, that our pandemic has given us an opportunity to examine more closely. So I think that some of that will always continue to exist because the systems that we have, whether they're technology systems or human cultural systems, are not perfect. But I think that the spaceship car part of this is that actually think that we are more aware of the situation, and that I'm optimistic that because people are having this conversation more now, that as technology develops, we will be more aware of the consequences of how we use data, how we use other people's data. So I think that in the context, though, of learning and employment, I think this idea of portable records is really important because when an individual has control over their records, that's a way of giving individuals control over their next step, over their future. And I think that in my optimistic moment, I feel like we will have fixed this idea of how self-sovereignty could look in the context of lifelong learning, that we will understand the different variety of ways that people learn skills and be able to help them describe it in a verifiable way, and that they will then use these as currency in the employment marketplace. So I'll be optimistic, but also slightly pessimistic that maybe nothing will change.
Very good, very good. I'll take a quick crack at it, Martin. For me, I think the underestimated bad guy in the education world is sequence. The need to go from one place to another, etc. And in 10 years' time, it will be very apparent how bad the whole hard coding of sequence is for our education system. And one of the big players in this will be the portable learner record, because it's one of the things which really does give sovereignty, whether it's in the metaverse, where someone's really in charge of how they decide where to access information. No one's necessarily presenting it to them. They actually get to go where they want to, get the token or get whatever it is. So I'm hoping that 10 years on, we would have started to break apart the sequences.
Okay, thank you, Sanjay.
So I think it's going to be quite different. Actually, we're living it today. So just think about the transformation in the last 2 years in terms of the transition to a digital-based economy across all sectors of the economy, learning, employment, pretty much shopping. 10 years from now, it's just going to be a lot more. The other thing that's going to drive that is that the rise of AI and other kinds of mechanisms around automating digital transactions will be radically and dramatically different, because computing, the power of computing is going to grow exponentially over the course of the next decades. And so I think it's going to be a very different world. I think like what we're doing now today will be this and more, and that will be advised and driven by a lot of autonomous agents that make a lot of these decisions and sort things out. But to Sharon's point, we're still going to have the same, we're going to have new and different kinds of social problems, but the world in which we live will be completely digitized, and the distinction between the digital and the physical universe will be non-existent. It will all be one and the same.
Mm-hmm. So no piles of paper anymore, like I sketched in the beginning. Thank you, Alex, and finally Donna. But
yeah, I kind of go back and forth between the future is here, it's just not evenly distributed, versus like, where the heck is the future? It's like super late. I had islands in Second Life a while back. Like, now we're gonna meta. Okay, fine. Like I really think that it's conversations like this. I love the fact that the Iowa EdTech Collective is actually like thinking about this stuff. We actively get to shape what that future looks like in the little decisions that we make, and the big decisions that we make, in the RFP committees that we torture ourselves to sit on, in the way we think about sponsoring, from the different places where we kind of sit in places where we can help create those experiences for those learners that realize what we want the spaceship vision to look like. I'm really, I share the optimism while I'm super impatient for us to get there. But you really invite everyone to help us think through this, and kind of a welcome to figure out how to engage. I think we're all available in different kinds of social media presences and all that kind of stuff too. So I'd love to keep the conversation going because we get to shape this together.
Okay, well, so now we have come to the end of this discussion. I would like to thank the panelists for the great views and visions, and also like to thank the audience for their, not only attending this discussion, but also actively participating in it through the chat. This was really great. So thank you. I will hope to see you again at a next EdTech talk, powered by the EdTech Collaborative and Red Lamp. So thank you and have a great rest of your day.